So we're going to address each HTA question in course, as you know. The first will be uncertainty. With that, let me introduce, or not introduce again, but invite up Rick Chapman from ICER to talk us through, but also our kind of responders, Nick Crabb and Karen Lee, and also our prepared stakeholder reactions, which will be Robin Thompson, Pat Gleason, and Eric Gasho. Could you all kind of come on up here, and we'll let Rick get started.
There's one right here. There's two there. There's one there. Thank you, guys.
Rick, what do you try to go a little quicker? Sorry.
Yeah, in front of the slides.
Sorry, that isn't going to work out well.
You want to wait until after the slides and ask people?
Yeah, you know what? I didn't think about this, but A, you're not going to be able to see the slides, and B, people won't be able to see the slides through you, so we'll have you come up afterwards. Thank you.
So thanks, everyone, while we figure out the choreography here, and thanks for being here. Looking forward to the discussions. We've already started those, and consequently, you're 20 minutes behind schedule. But so the first topic we want to talk about today is uncertainty. And as we've heard, there may be some overlap with other types of diseases, and this isn't just something that's relevant for SSTs, and I'm going to use our abbreviation SSTs throughout my presentations. But there are some things about SSTs that have raised concerns about uncertainty. And as is mentioned, this is common to many conditions, especially rare conditions or serious or severe diseases. But a lot of these are also going to show up for these SSTs. Not all of these will be relevant for any particular situation, but some of them may come up. One of these is a limited understanding of the natural history of the disease, especially if it's a rare disease or one for which there have not been many treatments in the past. There may be novel mechanisms of action and delivery techniques for some of these treatments. Gene therapies and cell therapies, relatively new, haven't been used a lot. And so there may be long-term safety concerns about some of these types of treatments. If there's a rare disease, especially, there's small populations, and a lot of these severe diseases have progressive symptoms over time. And this may make randomized controlled trials difficult or infeasible to conduct. And in consequence, may have to rely on single-arm trials, which may be more vulnerable to unknown biases and may be more difficult to assess. There's often going to be limited follow-up for these treatments, relatively short-term, and so there's going to be a lot of questions about the long-term safety and durability of effect. Is this really a cure, or is something going to change somewhere down the road? For a lot of these diseases, especially if there haven't been good treatments out there, there's often a lack of good patient-centered outcome measures, and so we often have to rely on surrogate outcome measures, and there may be a lot of question about how relevant those are to what patients really care about. And finally, because there may often be a lack of good treatments for these diseases, there may be a lack of understanding of what's good basic supportive care for these patients, what's going to be our comparator here. I think the other aspect of SSTs that may raise more concerns around uncertainty is that we have this combination of uncertainty along with the possibility of major unrecoverable cost. So as we said with SSTs, there's going to be a short-term treatment, so the cost is generally going to be short-term or amortized over short-term. And so there's a possibility that if this turns out not to have long-term durability of benefit, that those costs are going to be unrecoverable. So I think that raises the issue of uncertainty in people's minds. So we looked at, after we did a literature review and interviews, we looked at a lot of different ways we could potentially assess uncertainty for SSTs. And I'm going to go through some of those right now. One was cure proportion modeling. This is just a different type of survival analysis that acknowledges that some fraction of patients may be cured while others are not, and that typical parametric survival analysis techniques won't be able to capture that. There's other alternative survival analysis techniques which may be relevant for these treatments as well, and we examined some of those. We also looked at threshold analyses at different time horizons. So one of the big uncertainties is around durability of effect. So one way to look at that is to look at what would happen over different time horizons, including an analysis to look at the durability of effect that would be needed to achieve certain cost-effectiveness thresholds. So how long would we have to get an effect from a treatment at a given price for it to be cost-effective? We also explored looking at alternative plausible scenarios. And so this was a way to try to characterize uncertainty by saying, let's look at a plausible optimistic scenario where we're looking at certain variables and bringing them up to where if it really works as well as we think it will, this is where things will be. And then we also looked at plausible conservative scenarios, which were, if you took the more conservative viewpoint that for a lot of these variables, what's that going to look like? And so that was one of the things we examined, whether that would be helpful to characterize uncertainty for decision makers. And then we also looked at a couple of methods that were related to probabilistic sensitivity analysis, or PSA. One of these was based on an example from the JCVI in the UK around vaccines, which looked at tying the probabilistic sensitivity analysis and a certain level of uncertainty to a lower cost-effectiveness threshold. So it was basically saying if above a certain percentage of PSA simulations go above a certain threshold, then maybe we need to consider a different threshold here because of the level of uncertainty. And finally, there were recommendations that the uncertainty found in probabilistic sensitivity analyses could be tied to a policy recommendation for consideration of other payment arrangements, such as an outcomes-based contract or something like that. So these are all ways to try to deal with some of the uncertainty here and take some of the risk away from payers, or to give decision makers other ways to consider the uncertainty. So we took some of these methods and applied them to some of our models that we had from prior assessments to see what kind of impact they would have. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we found here. When we looked at threshold analyses at different time horizons, we found that this was feasible and relatively easy to put into practice in models. But we thought it was unclear how appraisal committees would be able to integrate these multiple time horizons into their judgments of long-term value for money. So we're used to looking at lifetime horizons and long-term value for money. When we start to talk about these shorter horizons, it's unclear how you would really integrate those into your thinking in terms of how that would affect the value. We also looked at alternative plausible scenarios, tried to come up with some of those and run them through our models. One of the first things we realized is it's a challenge to determine what's really a plausible scenario. People may have very different ideas about what they consider plausible for a given treatment, especially given that we don't know a lot about these treatments and there's a lot of uncertainty around them. And we were concerned that there might be a potential unintended consequence of presenting these scenarios along with base cases as some sort of elevated results, because it might cause people to rely on just those scenarios and not give enough attention to other sensitivity analyses, such as univariate or probabilistic sensitivity analyses, which may give a broader characterization of the uncertainty. We looked at tying probabilistic sensitivity analysis to a different cost-effectiveness threshold. In particularly, we looked at 90% of cost-effectiveness ratios having to be under $150,000 per quality. When we did that, in some cases, we did see that that would lead to lower value-based prices, in some cases relatively substantial lower. But we realized it was unclear which specific percentage threshold we should use here. 90%, it could be 95%, some could say it should be 80%, and some could argue about the $150,000 per quality threshold, which threshold should be used here. We're also aware that anything based on probabilistic sensitivity analyses is going to be sensitive to the distribution of the values that we use in PSA, and those distributions may not be well characterized in a lot of cases. And there may be correlation between some of the variables that are included in a probabilistic sensitivity analysis, but we may not know enough details to be able to build that correlation into our PSAs. And finally, when we looked at tying PSA to secondary policy recommendation for outcomes-based treatment, if there's a certain level of uncertainty, we found that this was feasible to implement, but again, it's unclear which specific percentage threshold we should use there to characterize it as being above a certain level of uncertainty. So once we had done this, we really sat back and considered, well, what should we propose as adaptations to our value framework when we're looking at SSTs? And these are what we put into our proposed document and part of what we'd like to get feedback on. The first one here is really more about process than about methods. It's really about when will we be using our SST framework. And so what we propose is in our draft scoping document, we will include a statement over whether we think this therapy qualifies as an SST. We always get comments back on our draft scoping document, and so following comments, we will revisit that decision and make a final decision about whether this will be considered an SST and whether we'll be using our adapted framework going forward. Then when it comes to some of the methods proposals, one of the things we proposed is to look at threshold analyses at different time horizons. We will continue to do our standard lifetime horizon, but we will also do a horizon that looks at the longest available follow-up data, so looking at what we know now with no projections forward. And we also have proposed doing threshold or time horizon analyses at 5 years and 10 years. And we would continue to present our standard lifetime horizon, as I mentioned. And importantly, when the price is known, we think it would be interesting to do a threshold analysis to understand how long the treatment would need to be effective at the known treatment effect. So assuming it remains effective based on what we know now, how long would it have to maintain that effectiveness at a given price for it to be cost effective at different thresholds? And so that, I think, would give people some sense of how much uncertainty there is around durability of effect, and really talk about the durability of effect that would be needed to achieve these standard cost-effectiveness thresholds. In terms of the probabilistic sensitivity analyses, we've proposed doing a PSA and at a given level of uncertainty, tying that to a secondary policy recommendation that payers may want to consider outcomes-based payments. And in particular, we've suggested that if greater than 25% of our simulations in the probabilistic sensitivity analysis have ICERs that are greater than $200,000 per QALY, that policy recommendation will kick in, and we'll say that outcomes-based contracting may be considered as a preferred method of payment in these cases. So those are our proposed adaptations and what we found when we looked in the literature, and I think now we'll ask the reactants to come up and have our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to, again, have some prepared reactions and comments from folks from NICE and CADITH, and then from different stakeholder perspectives. And then we'll have time for the group discussion, and we can reflect a bit on some of the comments that you guys have already submitted as well. All right. Since I think I'll just go down the line here. Nick, what's your sense of this from the NICE perspective, and how have you guys tried to address, if you will, the question about whether there's a magnitude of uncertainty or a type of uncertainty that's different for certain kinds of treatments, and whether it requires alternative HTA approaches?
Okay. Sorry. Thanks very much, Steve. Just before I get into sort of uncertainty, I did want to just thank ICER for the opportunity to participate in this study, and for Helen and I to be at the summit today. if we're still using the term SSTs for now anyway, then I think sort of innovation in health technologies, including sort of SSTs, without doubt, can provide sort of challenges to HTA sort of value frameworks and methods. And I think it's really, really good that we can sort of collaborate and sort of share best practice internationally. I think there's a slide, isn't there? Is there do we have one slide? Yeah. Yeah. There's a couple of initiatives that Helen and I will be mentioning a few times as we sort of go through today. So we just thought we'd show this one slide now. So the first one was a study we did a few years back in collaboration with the University of York on the appraisal and assessment of regenerative medicines. And the other key initiative is our current update to the NICE Health Technology Evaluation Methods, which includes the methods for technology appraisals and highly specialised technology evaluations. So we'll be talking about those again. So if anybody's interested, we just put the links up in that slide. Managing uncertainty is obviously a really key issue for SSTs. So at the point of regulatory approval and launch, little may be really known about the long-term health impacts. So we might find that products appear very, very promising. It might even be clear that they represent major advances on the currently available therapies. But it's going to take, in some cases, several years of follow-up before the sort of magnitude of those benefits are properly understood. So, as we all know, it's very difficult to estimate the full benefits and cost effectiveness at the point of launch. And I think, as sort of Mark was saying earlier, I think this, some of these problems, many of these problems, are not unique to SSTs. It's a very, very common problem in HTA. But I think it's also clear that products where we're hoping that they might be curative, it clearly becomes a much, much bigger problem for that type of product. And managing uncertainty was certainly highlighted as one of the key issues in the NICE Regenerative Medicine study. And it's also one of the key themes in the current methods review at NICE. So just in terms of the way we sort of think about uncertainty, from a methods perspective, sort of probabilistic and deterministic sensitivity analyses are the sort of very, very sort of routinely applied. But uncertainty is also managed through not only through the sort of HTA methods, but through commercial considerations and managed access arrangements. So there's policy levers, as Steve was saying earlier, other than the sort of methodological considerations. So just for example, there could be very, very high uncertainty in long-term clinical outcomes, but that could potentially translate into relatively low decision uncertainty if the product was priced primarily in relation to known outcomes. So where there does remain considerable uncertainty, though, in that sort of clinical and cost effectiveness, managed access arrangements, such as the ones that we use for the Cancer Drugs Fund in England, they can facilitate timely patient access while the evidence base is evolving. And just using those sort of managed access arrangements as an example, they typically include commercial arrangements as well as data collection arrangements. And where necessary, they could include outcomes-based payments or rebates. Although I think the preference tends to be to use those arrangements only where really needed, because they can be very sort of administratively burdensome. One limitation I must point out, because we want to be balanced as possible, the managed access arrangements currently being agreed in the Cancer Drugs Fund and also in NICE's highly specialised technologies programme, they are focusing on relatively short time periods, perhaps typically 2 to 5 years. So they may not fully address the needs of reducing uncertainties for SSTs. Now, just turning now to some of the sort of detail that Steve was talking about in his presentation. we thought there was lots of really helpful stuff in the reports. So cure proportion modelling, for example, I mean, it's potentially a very important approach to SSTs. We also observed that it's a potentially important approach to other treatments where there seems to be a subpopulation that gains very sustained health improvements, and I think we're seeing that in some cases with some of the immune oncology combinations. And again, our methods wouldn't stop anybody from submitting a cure proportion model in their submission. So there's no reason why that approach couldn't be used in evaluation by NICE. We also thought that the incremental cost effectiveness scenarios at multiple time horizons, that's a really useful way to illustrate potential cost effectiveness over a range of durability of clinical effect scenarios. And we thought that those approaches could actually be quite helpful in sort of commercial negotiations, but also in sort of committee considerations of uncertainty. Similarly, we thought that the time horizon threshold analyses for durability of effect could be very helpful. And again, there's not really any reason why such analyses couldn't be included in company submissions, or they could potentially be sort of modelled by the sort of evidence review groups that work as part of the sort of NICE process. Obviously, the applicable thresholds would be the ones that we use, which are different to the ones used by ICER. So we did think that a lot of that, seemed very helpful. Finally, the sort of principle around the probabilistic sensitivity analyses linked to policy recommendations for outcome-based payments, the principle seems reasonable. The only thing we would do, though, is we would caution against sort of the routine use of outcome-based payment approaches, because we think they could be very resource intensive, and that resource intensity could be for the healthcare providers, for the payers, and also for the companies themselves. And I think we thought that where possible, a sort of a pricing scenario that ensured that less than 25% of the PSA simulations of the base case produced ICERs above the proposed threshold would be a more efficient way of and probably a more sustainable approach. We do acknowledge, though, that in the face of major uncertainty, outcomes-based payment methods may well be needed in some cases, but I think it's a good principle to use them where needed, and not to use them on a more routine basis. And finally, we also need to recognise that PSAs are only as good as the assumptions and estimates that go into them. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Just first to start, I would like to thank ICER for the invitation to participate in the summit today. We're happy to be part of the discussion with ICER on common issues that we're all trying to address. So as Steve laid out, we at CADITH are currently discussing some of the very same issues that are being discussed at ICER as well as at NICE. So it's good to hear and have a good exchange between colleagues in terms of what we're all thinking. We're also interested to hear what your thoughts are as well from the audience today, so we look forward to the discussion. Just by way of background, CADITH is similar to ICER in that we are an arm's-length organization, meaning that we don't ultimately make decisions regarding reimbursement, so we're not budget holders. So we produce science reports or reviews similar to ICER, and our expert committee makes recommendations to healthcare decision makers in Canada. That means we don't have as much information with respect to price negotiations or any managed access agreements that might be negotiated, just by way of background. In terms of the topic of uncertainty, uncertainty was a topic that received much attention when we updated our guidelines for economic evaluations recently in 2017. And this aspect permeated a number of different topics within our guidelines. So within analyses, we do recommend probabilistic analyses are conducted as the reference case to account for parameter uncertainty. In terms of our target population, we make specific recommendations to considered stratified populations, looking at clinically relevant homogeneous groups by which we could determine whether or not treatments are cost-effective or where a treatment may be most cost-effective. And in the topic of uncertainty, in addition to considering parameter uncertainty through probabilistic analyses, we recommended scenario analyses to consider structural uncertainty as well as potentially additional reference cases to address methodological uncertainty. So we spent a lot of time discussing this topic when the working group was discussing the update to our guidelines. We felt the topic warranted much more emphasis as it's critical for decision makers to understand the impact of uncertainty and the likelihood of making the right decision. But despite uncertainty, decision makers will still need to make a decision, but this allows them to understand the implications of the decisions they take and whether or not there's other levers to consider, such as reassessments or pricing mechanisms. So, as Steve mentioned, the challenge for potentially curative therapies, or SSTs, is the fact that we have certainty with respect to the cost of the treatment being incurred on day one, and yet high clinical uncertainty associated with some of the benefits, especially in the longer term, not only benefits but also potentially harms. So at CADITH, we've reviewed a number, or a few, SSTs, and some of the questions that were raised during our review were: how do we define a cure? This potential need for retreatment and durability of effect. What potential changes occur to clinical pathways, and do we have a good understanding of what the changes are to the natural history of the condition? Are there risks of other disease-related complications? And is there a potential for increased harms that we don't know? And so the challenge with these treatments is that they do tend to be associated with a lot more clinical uncertainty, and hence the value of conducting economic evaluations, and especially considering these through scenario analyses. But that said, we don't understand we don't know what we don't know. And that's the challenge for us as well as our committees, that we can't test for outcomes and events that we don't know could occur in the future. So often the analyses that are submitted to us from sponsors provide to us an optimistic scenario where patients are cured and there's no further implications in terms of health, which is a bit challenging for us. So in response to some of the proposals from ICER, based on the 4th edition of our guidelines, the presentation of uncertainty is a key element. Some of the elements recommended by ICER are in line with what we're recommending. For uncertainty with treatment effect, we agree that the best fit for survival data is necessary, as well as scenario analyses looking at various survival analytic techniques where necessary, especially in cases where data is not mature. We also consider optimistic and conservative scenarios, but more specifically regarding the clinical data and not necessarily an overall best case and an overall worst case. We also recommend reporting the percentage of simulations at or below specific thresholds, which we think could be informative to decision makers when negotiating on price, but we don't set any specific decision rules with respect to when to negotiate. CADITH also recommends a lifetime time horizon, and our preference is to maintain that, considering uncertainty with respect to longer-term effects, such as treatment waning or attenuation effect through modeling. But we understand, especially when we're reviewing sponsors' economic evaluations, sometimes the only way that we can look at these different aspects is through truncating the time horizon. So we're dealing with a number of issues to address uncertainty, similar to what's being proposed by ICER, and we feel that the focus on uncertainty is an important one, and we do feel that it's currently adequately addressed within our guidelines. There may be some specific aspects to consider for SSTs, but generally speaking, the recent update of our guidelines does focus a lot on the area of uncertainty. In addition, we feel that other methods may be required over time, and we may consider updates to our guidelines, but we don't feel necessarily that they're specific to SSTs and potentially curative therapies, but may apply more broadly. And then further, we have a technical working group on health economics, and one of our focuses is pertaining to clinical uncertainty, as that affects all economic evaluations across the board.
Thank you. Let me just, again, introduce the folks who are going to comment now. We tried for most of these to get someone from the life science industry, someone from the payer world, and someone from the patient community. They obviously speak for themselves as individuals, but they may channel some of the common reactions that different perspectives will bring to some of these questions. So our first set includes Robin Thompson, who's at Biogen. And we'll have Pat Gleason from Prime Therapeutics and Eric Gasho from the National Health Council. And it looks like that's the order in which you sat. Thank you very much. So go right ahead, and then we'll have the group discussion after you guys.
Thank you very much, Steve. So I'd like to thank ICER for the opportunity to participate in this summit. So I'm a health economist. I work in the value and access function. I'm based in Switzerland. I'm also the global HTA lead at Biogen. I was part of the Spinraza launch team, so specifically supporting the HTA evidence strategy and also the execution across our global affiliates. I'm also part of the FPIA HTA working group, which is focusing a lot on HTA harmonization and coordination. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. So I just wanted to give before commenting on the uncertainty, I wanted to take a slightly different angle, but also to give a flavour of my current role. So really, I suppose I'm the eyes and ears for our internal team of the HTA requirements. So we have obviously cross-functional teams, clinical development teams, regulatory, medical, and so my role would certainly be to try and keep a handle on certainly the HTA ecosystem and how it's evolving. And it's remarkable how it is evolving globally. So certainly in terms of the HTA requirements, this thinking is then incorporated into our clinical development plans. So there are various ways, of course, we go about collecting this type of information. We certainly utilize early scientific advice across the board where we can. That's a critical area for us. But I think importantly, and I wanted to stress this issue, is that we look at precedent. So we look at decisions that have been made previously by HTA bodies, and that certainly impacts the way in which we think about the evidence that we're collecting. So we wanted to take a little bit of a step back and think about the evidence itself that's being collected, so the evidence ratings matrix, and how that fits in to the SST adaptations, proposed adaptations. So certainly, I mean, our response to the public consultation on SSTs highlighted an example where you have a grading of or a rating of trials of very different quality in terms of you might have a single arm trial, one center vis-a-vis a phase 3 randomized controlled trial, multi-center international trial. So there's I think an important discussion that we would welcome around the evidence rating within the context of SSTs. And importantly, I mean, I think how that encourages pharmaceutical companies or life science companies in terms of how they think about evidence going forward. So, I mean, I think that's really the key quality issue that we would want to discuss in this panel. Thank you.
Hello, Pat Gleason at Prime Therapeutics. We're a pharmacy benefit manager owned by 18 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans and servicing another 5, so 23 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans across the United States. I'm going to start out with some numbers, since as someone that a pharmacist by training and works in forecasting the expenditures for these new products to help absorb their cost on behalf of our Blue Cross Blue Shield plans and the self-insured employers that they represent and provide services for, as well as a fully insured business in the commercial marketplace of 17 million commercially insured lives that Prime Therapeutics has. That's about 1 in 20 Americans. Just some numbers for you for context here. In 2018, last year, across 17 million individuals who had at least 1 month of eligibility with our Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, they spent $40.1 million to treat 85 SMA patients, spinal muscular atrophy patients. That's all new spend that didn't exist in 2016, for example. And then $26.2 million to treat 26 patients with congenital hypophosphatemia. So that's $66.7 million to treat 116 individuals with these conditions. To Michael Sherman's point earlier, this is about affordability and continued access to medications for Americans. And that's why we're having this discussion, frankly, and understanding this uncertainty. So we have these individuals that have started on these therapies and tuning up to 66 plus million. And in particular, we spent some time looking at Spinraza. I'm unfortunately going to call out a medication because we looked at the individuals who newly starting and found that the dosing to say that they're persistent within the first 9 months of therapy, less than 25%. I'm sorry, approximately 25% were not receiving all the doses. So we would call that waste. That's not even in the modeling right now. That's uncertainty that essentially is just incredibly important to start to become into the model. I mean, you call out, Steve, and I appreciate team, Rick and others, the opportunity to look at in the controversies and uncertainties section to expand it. I just have to say that the persistency of therapies there needs to be more modeling around that. I really like the plausible, optimistic, and conservative scenarios. I'd encourage you to reconsider. For me, that creates a confidence interval around a base case. And to the public, they only hear about the base case, basically. Even to our medical and pharmacy directors, which we just had a physicians and a pharmacy and therapeutics, a P&T meeting, in which we discussed the drugs. And the questions that I get as sort of the person that's to interpret the ICER reports that, frankly, none of them have time to read, are, what is the uncertainty? How is that accounted for? And then how does that translate into outcomes-based contracting, which is a role that I have for the company at Prime Therapeutics and try to deliver for our Blues plans. It's to negotiate with pharmaceutical manufacturers for these outcomes-based contracts. And if we have this confidence interval, this plausible, optimistic, and conservative assessment, then with that, especially the conservative side of things, we'll have the inputs that got you there to determine that conservative marker. And they help us because we can look at those and say, can we then contract around those specific outcomes? It becomes the neutral third party that you are and the intelligence you bring collaboratively into creating these reports. So it isn't just Prime Therapeutics or Express Scripts or CVS Health trying to come up with the endpoints of the potential outcomes-based contract, but it is the endpoints that were in the report. So I'm also I'm very much encouraged by your probabilistic sensitivity analysis and your proposed threshold. I'm a little puzzled on the 200,000. I don't know why it couldn't just be 150,000 because that's the number people are used to seeing. So I'd encourage you to reconsider that. I'll stop there and happy to answer questions later.
Thanks. Eric. Sure. So I'm going to give a little bit of the patient perspective on uncertainty and then kind of dig a little bit into the document. So one thing that I was sort of thinking about coming into this is that for someone with a chronic disease or disability or their family caregiver, uncertainty is very much a fact of life. So it's certainly something that when a person is going through a treatment decision with their provider, as they're weighing the benefits and the risks of their multiple options, uncertainty is one of those things that has to be considered as part of that decision making. When we're talking about SSTs, the benefits are pretty well known and pretty, how do I put this? It's about the best benefit you could possibly imagine when we're talking about cures here. So I think that the uncertainty of sort of what the long-term impacts are, both on the benefit and the risk side of the equation, becomes probably even more of a question than other types of treatments as well. So with that said, those are sort of the way that we've kind of been framing this when we were thinking through our comments on the document. Overall, we think that the uncertainty section makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of really good questions that are asked in here. With that said, we do have a couple critiques and a couple areas where we think there can probably be some broader expansion. So the first one is on looking at the 5 and 10 year time horizons and allowing payers to make their own decisions based on those as well. And one of the things that we are really thinking through is that 5-10 years may make sense in some disease areas, it may not in others. And we think that this is probably, as ICER has really improved the work that you do in bringing the patient perspective into value discussions, we think that this is probably an area where some of these time horizons could be informed by patient input based on the specific condition that we're talking about. Another one is on, it was in section 2.3, where, and the controversies and uncertainties talking about where data on patient outcomes is lacking. We thought that should be moved to, data on patient-centered outcomes. I think that it would be really helpful for the general public to understand what outcomes are being used as part of the review and what outcomes are being used in outcomes-based contracting. And to be able to say that perhaps the endpoints that were used in the clinical trials may have not been informed by patient input, I think would really add to an even greater level of uncertainty and would be something that by kind of looking to see whether or not patient input was used, I think will help encourage manufacturers as well as those who are negotiating the contracts to consider whether or not the outcomes were informed by patient input. And I do think that that's an area where that level of thinking, I think, can be expanded beyond just this document and to some of the other value assessment work that ICER is doing. Similarly, when we look at the probabilistic sensitivity analysis and looking at the optimistic and conservative scenarios, I think that we thought that was being used a bit narrowly to only focus it in on outcomes-based contracts. I think that there's value in thinking about these scenarios across the board when we consider SSTs. So I thought that was something that I wanted to highlight, and I look forward to discussion.
All right, thank you. So gear up your reach for your microphone in just a second. So I just want to reflect briefly on some of the themes that I heard and I know were echoed in some of the public comments that we received too. First, if you just take a step back, health economics handles uncertainty by doing another sensitivity analysis or another scenario analysis. And it says decision makers can handle this in whatever way they want to. And so there's a tension that we feel every step in this process where we're thinking about another time horizon, another scenario. Yes, we can create all of this richness, and then in the real world, even our appraisal committees, and I'm sure this is the same at NICE, they kind of say, what do you want us to do with all of this? Are we supposed to average them? Are we supposed to pick one and not the other? It's supposed to inform us, but there's an information overload component to dealing with uncertainty that I think is just a real fact of nature, and we have to kind of grapple with that a little bit. Because I know at ICER, again, and if you take it from our appraisal committees to the P&T committees or other policymaking groups, I often hear a single message, which is, tell us the right answer. Don't tell us 5 different things from which we have to pick the right answer. You are the ones we're trusting to pick the right answer. So there's a real interesting tension that I don't think we've sorted. And the other thing that's always on the table, and you heard it again here, there's an instinctual feeling that greater uncertainty in the payer world should be reflected by a lower price. But there's no hardwired way for HTA to do that at the current time. We ask for appraisal committees to think about it, and there's either an up-down decision or, for us, it's more complicated. So this, in some ways, this is a really thorny problem. And so we tried to create, in one way, this halfway measure of if there's so much uncertainty on a certain measure of the PSA and a threshold, then we will recommend an outcomes-based contract. And I was really surprised, honestly, in the public comment how controversial that was. People hated that idea. People are out there every day in this town going, outcomes-based contract is the future. We need to fix Medicaid best price so we can do more of it. Let's do it all together. But God forbid ICER say that we recommend that people consider outcomes-based contracting as the best outcome when there's this much uncertainty.
Why? The people who said that, why?
I think it's a feeling of being handcuffed. Somebody said, there are so many factors going into your decision about whether to do an outcomes-based contract. Sometimes the payers don't want to, the administrative burden. Manufacturers, in a sense, view it as a penalty point, that you're too uncertain, so you're only going to be available if you agree to my outcomes-based contract as a payer. So I think people felt that it was, and again, it was too prescriptive, I guess. Other people, and I hear this too, from different health economists, I'd love to hear some of them talking about it. The PSA is a lovely tool. It's one way to think about uncertainty, and it's often not the way that payers think about uncertainty. They think about it as optimistic and conservative. They don't think about a cloud of bees swarming together in a graph and some fancy line or curve. That's not how they want to think about uncertainty. So that's why, one of the reasons why I find this fascinating, and it is hard sometimes to say, why is this just about, SSTs and not about other things? And it's partly, again, the scale issues, the scale of the benefits that we could be reaping, the uncertainty about them, and the scale of the costs that are potentially unrecoverable at the front end. So I could say more about some of my take on the public comments. I will say one other thing was that we have received comments that really push ICER to consider more formal reductions in the cost-effectiveness threshold for uncertainty through either borrowing tools from the financial analyst world, in which they downgrade stock prices by volatility of cash flow. There are ways that you can, for those of you who knew what beta is, volatility, there are different ways to weave uncertainty into a discounted stock price, if you will, and people say that's an obvious analog to what payers want in this setting. So another approach that's really blunt would be to say, okay, optimistic and conservative scenario, we think there's a 50% chance that this is a lifelong cure, and maybe a 50% chance that it only works 10 years. We could either give you those two scenarios, or we could blend them and say, our base case is the blend between those two. 50, whatever percent we think is the likelihood of going in one direction or another. And imagine the fights that's going to, because this isn't data anymore, right? This is a hunch. This is which clinical experts you're talking to. This is whether you've ever seen a patient with a with an adenovirus, associated vector have an adverse event or not. This is so driven by instinct and not by evidence that it gets really tricky for ICER or anybody to say there's one base case. But as Pat said, often that's what payers are looking for. So like Dick, I'm not solving any of these problems. I'm kind of putting them out on the table. But I will say that the public comments were very thoughtful in the area of uncertainty. Many of them were very powerful in arguing that we should do more with uncertainty than just provide further time horizons and sensitivity analyses. Let's hear from you guys. Dick, Dan, Melanie. Okay, we'll start there.
So first off, I wouldn't use just 25% over a threshold, because that doesn't take into account the loss. You've got very different possibilities there. Think of your distribution of your cost effectiveness ratio. Median, 190,000, very tight, but 25% is over the threshold. Another one, median 125, very flat. It goes way out on the long side. That's where a loss function comes in. The dollars matter, not just the percentage over the threshold. So I think the insurers would care about that, because there are very different solutions to the two different kinds of distributions, right? If it's 190, you ask for a rebate, all right? But there's not The uncertainty is as you characterized it, but it's really not much uncertainty. Right? So I'd look at it.
So you want some kind of
loss function
of empirical value attached to the spread.
Well,
right?
When I taught statistics, one of the last weeks we taught loss functions, and it goes beyond, it's a weighted value of the uncertainty.
All right, we'll talk more about that when we get down into the details of the statistics. I said Dan, then Melanie, and then we'll start to circle around. Dan?
Great. Dan Ollendorf with Tufts. So as I've been thinking through this and reflecting back on the comments that our group made, I'm actually a fan of these hunch-driven approaches. So the threshold analysis, testing the duration of benefit required to hit a certain cost-effectiveness threshold, or the optimistic and conservative scenario. There's no reason to think that a PSA somehow lends more precision to this discussion, because in this case, so unlike chronic medications, at least cost-effectiveness evaluations in the US of chronic medications, typically it's drug price that's swamping the assessment in terms of uncertainty. In this case, it's all about duration of benefit. So if you're doing a PSA, no matter how well you do it, and you really have very little to no data on the distributional form of that duration of benefit, it's not really going to add much more to the conversation. So if you do these additional analyses that are maybe more straightforward to understand, and you're coming up with, let's say, maybe not two scenarios, but you have optimistic and conservative at two different ends and maybe some shades of gray in between, and everything's coming under a decision threshold, that's important information. Just be clear about the hunches and the rationale that went into it.
All right, good. I also want to weave into your thinking, because I didn't mention it myself earlier, but Robin's point, which I think is really important for HTA to think about, is whatever we do with our methods, we want to incentivize better evidence that will reduce that uncertainty. So we don't just want to say, come with what you may, we'll manage it. We want to try to think about the upstream effects and how that can really influence investments and research development programs, et cetera. Melanie?
I keep coming back to how these SSTs or what we're going to land on calling these are different from other therapies. And with the PSA is a great tool to capture parameter uncertainty, but SSTs are largely different from being very sensitive to structural uncertainty. And we see this between standard parametric versus flexible parametric versus Cure modeling. And so just to reiterate that this doesn't capture all of uncertainty, and if we are going to link that to recommendations like outcomes-based pricing, to be aware that this is just capturing parameter uncertainty and potentially not all of parameter uncertainty. And then Rick mentioned Cure proportion modeling, and I don't think we've discussed that much today. And speaking of hunches, there's still hunches that go into Cure proportion modeling too. When are we going to define Cure? At what point? Is this data-driven by when we see a plateau in our survival curve? Is it based on evidence of prior therapies where we see long-term survivors and when that's typically defined? And so keeping in mind, if Cure proportion modeling, which I see as where SSTs could be different from other technologies that are evaluated based on these particularly unique survival curves, if Cure proportion modeling is going to be what's used in the base case for these, to keep in mind how we are going to define what is Cure, even within each of those products.
Okay. Lou, I think you were jumping out of your seat.
Oh, seriously, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Please
for
introduce.
Thank you for the invitation. Lou Garrison, the University of Washington. And I really want to speak to the responsive ISPOR that Dick and I worked on around uncertainty. You may recall that in about 2016, we had a number of value frameworks. We set up a value we set a special task force with Mike Drummond, Milt Weinstein, Chuck Phelps, Patricia Danzin. I can go on, Darius Lakdawala. And we basically tried to straighten out some of the thinking. And as economists, we were mostly interested in the same decision that ICER is, what goes in my health benefit package, and in particular my formulary when I'm thinking about medicines. And, we basically said, like you guys do, that the quality provides a good starting point. And as Mark will always remind us, health gain is the core driver here, the quality. But we also said we need to worry about uncertainty-related elements, okay? And we fleshed some of that out in the report. But since that report, you've had Chuck Phelps, who was on the panel, come and talk about work he's done on the willingness to pay for life years and a threshold. So he sort of revisited work he'd done 20 years ago with Alan Garber and updated that to in a sort of a willingness to pay. And then he and Darius have done some work extending some of the ideas that we talked about in terms of health insurance, insurance value, which had two components: financial risk protection and health risk protection. So I think in this, I think health risk protection was particularly underappreciated because I think we all kind of realize, oh, we're not just paying for rarity, but it's the combination of rarity with health catastrophe, which is this, what you're calling this, this large impact. And in subsequent work, that has come out in the last NBR working paper, Darius and Chuck Phelps have really, I think, captured what you were getting at, your intuition for why you feel differently about uncertainty. If you have more certainty, it's more valuable to you. And what they basically say is the methods we normally use in cost effectiveness, and that ICER uses, essentially looks at the mean treatment effect and doesn't take account of the variance, and that's what you're talking about. If that variance is reduced, that's value. That's the value. That's health insurance value. And then they also work into that framework the fact that if you have the cure fraction and the tail, and as Dick was talking about, that tail, that avoiding that, or said it's valuable to have that option for a tail, to have a flat that plateau, and that we can formalize the value of that. And what our test, and really Darius was probably leading our thinking on this, and said it's not that it's really, it does lead to different ranking of technologies, but it's really corrective. If we ignore those things, we're ignoring important things that matter to people, which is your intuition. And we're ignoring that uncertainty and the value of reducing that. So I guess I would go back and challenge Darius and Chuck to say, well, Chuck, you were able to derive a threshold out of a theoretical model. Could you guys tell us what the percentage increase, if we make an assumption about risk aversion? And this is key. They say that our normal quality maximization assumes risk neutrality. And risk aversion is a fact of life, and we need to take that into account. So sorry to be so long-winded, but that was the essence, I think, of what we were trying to submit in our comments for MISPOR, that we need these are important things, and we can work at valuing them, and we shouldn't forget them.
Yeah, I know the opportunity cost side of the aisle might want to respond to uncertainty as a factor. No, but what you're pointing out is good. Actually, who mentioned?
No, I mean we are saying there's we want to consider a threshold, and that can be driven by opportunity costs. I mean, that could be the threshold to be out of opportunity costs. So it doesn't preclude using opportunity costs. Right. What are you comparing against?
Right. And again, there are different kinds of uncertainty. There's the variance around a mean that can be tight. There's a spread, and then there's two distinct bars. It works long term, or it wears off in 5 years, with no spread in between. And that's the optimistic, from patients.
But in that working paper, the nice thing is they bring that together. They bring that together, and they say they can provide evaluation of those 3 moments of that distribution. Yeah.
And Pat, and Mark, I'll get to you. I have to keep my eyes up. The other thing about cures that I'm actually not sure this made it into the technical brief, but somebody raised it. To the extent that we feel that we pay but don't get the clinical benefits because of poor adherence or inappropriate use in some way, if it's a single or short-term course, you increase the chance that the patient will get the appropriate dose and will get the clinical benefits, right? Because they get the shot, they don't have to come back again, they don't lose things, they don't fail to follow up, all those things. So there's if you will, an intangible because there's no real-world evidence on it in the short term, but it's something that some people want to think about as one of the values of a single
I have to add to that, though. What's not currently in modeling is that, for example, with Zolgensma, they would go on to Spinraza. So in your model right now, there is no cost added to someone who, because they aren't, for whatever, hitting that milestone, and we have an FDA-approved therapy that's $700,000 in the first year and $350,000 every year thereafter, that they would move to that therapy. And that is not an input of cost.
That's right. That's where I think we made a loose policy recommendation that payers get their money back if that happens.
That's a fallacy. So.
Fallacies? No, not at all. All right, I want to make sure. I know I've got Mark in next hands, David. Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting ideas in the document, but I was a little bit surprised that the fact that there's a framework out there, which is at the core of, for example, the second panel's report, and indeed the ISPOR modelling guidelines of whatever that was, 2015, which I think there are real issues about how you practically implement it. But I think they draw together a number of the points and the challenges that you mentioned. That intuitive feeling amongst payers that a lower price needs to apply when there's greater uncertainty. Dick's point about a loss function, for example, and the incentivization of evidence. Mm-hmm. And that is the framework that we can use our uncertainty analysis to quantify the value of evidence, to quantify the value of more precise evidence. We call it expected value of information analysis, but it's a set of tools that we readily apply in these models, and submissions to NICE would often include that, and quite possibly your own work as well. And what that can do is that it can indicate, essentially, if a manufacturer comes with better evidence, more precise evidence, less uncertainty, there is a higher price that can be generated on the basis of that. Equally, less evidence, more uncertainty, a potentially lower price. Now, the context of that, I think, is whether or not you believe the types of challenges to evidence generation for these types of products are inherent and immovable. I think I would argue some of them, I mean, clearly there are major challenges in generating evidence in this area, but I think you could also argue that most of them are not immovable with greater investment. So this ultimately comes down to a trade-off for manufacturers. Generate greater evidence, pay for that, and accept the risks associated with additional research with the promise of a higher price, or avoid those additional risks, reduce the amount of investment in research, but accept a lower price at launch. And that framework, I think, is really offers that ability to bring that together analytically and provide payers with the sort of information they need.
So maybe, I mean, Nick, you can reflect on this too. I've been profoundly unimpressed with the ability of expected value of further information to help decision makers. I just have. I've never seen it help. NICE, where you've had health economists telling you to do it for years, how does it weave into your appraisal committee meetings today?
Well, I guess my sort of main experience has been when the uncertainty was subject to a huge amount of analyses in the regenerative medicine support, and it was really very helpful to the special committee that we set up for that project.
So say more. How is it helpful? How would it have helped them know what operative cost-effectiveness threshold to use, or what value-based price would be?
I don't think they were thinking of it in those sort of level of detail. It was what they were confronted with was sort of, you know, in this case it was hypothetical products rather than real products. Right. But they were faced with hypothetical products with enormous levels of uncertainty, and some of the tools that were used by the team at York to describe that uncertainty and to illustrate the impacts of paying those sort of prices in terms of sort of, you know, net health benefit, that type of thing. Some of those illustrations, you know, the feedback we got from that committee, and it was a committee comprising mainly people who'd been on real NICE committees. Mm-hmm. And they did find it in the context of that exercise where they were looking at levels of uncertainty they'd not seen before in real appraisals. Because this is going back not many years, but just a few years before the sort of ATMPs that we've had to actually use, had to actually evaluate, and they did report that it was very, very helpful. Helen, I don't know if you've got any more up-to-date information on real appraisals.
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily standardly ask for companies to provide that information, so I think it's something that we have discussed internally. We will consider it as part of the NICE methods review, but I think, you know, what we try and encourage committees to do now, and what we want to do more, is actually being more explicit about each of the uncertainties in an analysis. So to actually talk about, you know, are these uncertainties are likely to be resolved short term, long term? You know, is it feasible? You know, are these just uncertainties you might have to just make a judgment on and accept? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, how far do you want to go out to still be, you know, 15 years, 20 years? You know, treatment pathways will have moved on. But also, the other factor for committees as well, it talks about, you know, the actual population that you're considering, and the limitations of collecting data for that patient population. And I know it's something that's been mentioned in our, to look at in our methods review already. And I think that will be quite challenging, but I think it is a really important consideration. Do you believe the company has actually done as much as they can in terms of evidence generation?
Right.
But I think it's quite a difficult judgment for the committee to make, really.
And that's part of what we wrestled throughout the process, was in our own thinking, do we want to brand a different kind of uncertainty for SSTs? Because PSAs get at kind of everything. What you were saying about, and I even mentioned it as a positive thing, we want the methods to incentivize better evidence, but to a certain extent, the special uncertainty around SSTs is not solvable by the company. It's what happens 15 years out. They can't fix that. It's the relative effectiveness, short term, they can do better with. Absolutely. But when the major hinge of a optimistic and a conservative scenario has nothing to do with that, it has everything to do with the natural history of the condition, or again, durability 10 to 15 years out, as it was for the very first MS outcomes-based agreement, it doesn't provide us much to go on. And yet the payers and others are trying to figure out whether there should be a lower price based on that kind of uncertainty, which it's not just durability of effect, it can be even natural history of the condition, which is kind of woven in, makes it a little bit messier. But conceptually, we decided not to call out that there's one kind of uncertainty that we're going to focus on in a different way here. We didn't say we would do an optimistic and conservative scenario for a variety of reasons that are kind of mentioned in our proposal, but it's still something that we are considering and hearing about. Lou, did you have a?
Yeah, just a quick comment on your comment on uncertainty. The other thing, particularly with the mechanism of action of gene therapy and immune therapy, it strikes me that there's another element of uncertainty, which I would call the fat tail problem, that basically, because of the mechanisms of action of these therapies, there could be a wider range of things happening in the out years. So I look at that kind of on the distribution.
Good, you mean good and bad, or?
Sure, but mostly bad,
actually,
unfortunately, basically from a risk analysis. So I think Dan mentioned, this is all driven by duration of effect, but I would add a concern about the fat tails. There's all kinds, a scenario where, sure, you have a curative therapy for your prime condition, and 80% of those patients end up with a secondary malignancy, that kind of thing.
The I am legend scenario, as we call it sometimes. Let me just channel the patient perspective for a second, and Eric, you may want to comment on this. So, again, one perspective is when we have less certainty and we have limited resources and we are thinking about opportunity costs, that there should be some downward risk adjustment for the uncertainty and what we're really going to get out of a promising new treatment. We might say that among the goals of our health system are included not just health gain, but providing an ecosystem in which the possibility of having a potential cure is worth something. And therefore, we wouldn't want to downgrade the prices attributed or the cost effectiveness thresholds used, because there's an intrinsic, again, goal that we know can't be solved, that it's not solvable by the time it gets through FDA and has to face the payers. So I'm curious, because my gut feeling is that patients don't worry as much about the uncertainty as others do. But I could be wrong.
No, I don't think that's true. It's probably a different type of uncertainty. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I do think that the uncertainty of sort of the long-term impacts would probably be more based on the the potential good and bad stuff that was mentioned there. I think that is something that we do think about, sort of what does that mean to have a potential curative treatment or a long-term impact. And I think one of the other things to think about there, too, is sort of what could those potential things be further on down the road, but also not knowing what sort of the natural progression of a disease may be as someone is living into adulthood and living into living longer into life where, simply children aren't living that long these days. So I think that there are certain things that we would think about, but I don't think it's as much of a financial uncertainty that I think probably the other perspective has. I would love to hear from some of the other patient advocates in the room as well, because I know that we've been a little bit quiet right now with a lot of the health economics talk.
Understood. Mark.
Yeah, so Mark Skinner, I come from the hemophilia community. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the question of uncertainty, and certainly uncertainty around the durability of the gene therapies or the risk of mutagenesis or something downstream. I mean, the adverse event uncertainty is probably less of a concern than durability, and one of the questions that really arises is, should the health system limit my opportunity and my personal judgment in the risk-benefit that I'm willing to take? Every individual patient is going to be different, and there is a bit of a natural self-regulator on uncertainty with AAV-based gene therapies, because at least based on current science, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So when am I going to make the decision if I know that I cannot be retreated, I know that I am not eligible to have it boosted? I'm going to weigh very carefully whether or not I accept a therapy that has a range of giving me a 5% correction or an 80% correction, or it's going to last 5 or 10 years. And depending where I am in my life cycle, that 5 or 10 years may be manifestly have a different value than someone else. So I think it would be very helpful if there is going to be an uncertainty limiter in here, that any narrative or report either include sub-analysis for populations that might benefit from a different level of uncertainty, or that there be a detailed descriptive analysis that clearly characterizes patient perspectives and how they could influence the uncertainty paradigm. But for us, uncertainty is certainly going to be a very present decision, and we recognize that the first gene therapies to market for our condition won't be the last. There's another dozen in the pipeline that are in the studies.
Right.
And so for me, the answer of when to say yes is not so much just that it's available, but it's weighing it against everything else. So I think the market will self-regulate, and the anxiety over 20,000 patients with hemophilia coming in for a $5 million gene therapy on day one are a bit of an overreaction.
Okay. Anybody in life science? Oh, sorry, Annie first? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to make a comment about uncertainty, and I was 3 different things about that. The first is that a lot of these conversations that we're having and the comments that were made really would fall into, I think, your bucket of contextual considerations, controversies, other considerations. And going back to the comment that you made earlier, Steve, around a lot of times people just want a decision from ICER, a number, what your ultimate decision is. I think our overriding concern is that until those considerations make it into the base case, the lens through which patient communities make decisions isn't reflected in that base case. So that's something we've talked about before, and something I think is worth mentioning here. Uncertainty, as Eric said, is the everyday for patients. And now we're getting into a space, and this is, I think, a part of what Pat was talking about, where it's not just about the uncertainty of one particular product, but it's comparing products to one another now. And I think the assessments that ICER is producing could be a very valuable tool for patients and providers, not just payers, to better understand perhaps which products are best for which patient at which time, if we had confidence that the inputs going into them really reflected patient experience. But that goes back to making sure that the outcomes that are being utilized and the evidence that are going into those reviews reflected patient input at the beginning. So I think that's really important also when we're talking about outcomes-based contracting, that those outcomes, I think one of the issues with that is that we don't have outcomes in some disease spaces that reflect patient input. And so just to the last question is around uncertainty and how patients approach this. The uncertainty of an innovative or transformative therapy is often better than the certainty of doing nothing.
Got it. Paul, Paul.
And if I could just amplify...
Sorry, do you mind introducing
yourself?
yourself?
Sorry. Paul Mellmeyer with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. If I could just amplify just a few of the points that were just made. Patients face a whole host of uncertainties that don't necessarily break down into a conservative case, a base case, an optimistic case, nor what's my uncertainty at 5 years or 10 years, or any other perhaps oversimplified manner of evaluating what the future is going to hold. There are a whole host of directions, a whole host of time horizons, a whole host of considerations that patients would need to make in choosing their therapies and the potential benefits and risks that come about those. So I think the nuance that patients face in trying to evaluate what that future holds also could be reflected within the analyses that ICER puts forward. That it's nuanced, and as kind of Eric was saying before, with not necessarily 5 and 10 years being most accurate or most reflective of the certain situation that the drug or the disease may bring. That's the patient's uncertainty that is inherent, and as they're making decisions, don't necessarily fall within these specific buckets either.
One of the tensions around the time horizons, again, we'll be providing lots of them. We thought that if we did always a 5 and 10 and one with the duration of the available evidence, it would help our appraisal committee start to get calibrated around seeing the same evidence at the same thresholds over time and being able to kind of compare across conditions the levels of uncertainty. If we pick a different threshold for each condition, it would serve one potential purpose. But then we have the question about whether we also give the 5 and 10 just to give them some anchors that they can kind of get used to. I'm still not sure. We're just not sure. It's part of an experiment about whether our appraisal committees, what they will do with all these different time horizons. Because they take a vote on long-term value for money, but that's different than an up or down coverage vote. And our value-based price range is still going to be a range. So we have to end up picking something to use for there. Somebody else had their hand up. Yes, Josh.
Hey, Josh Carlson, University of Washington. Just to clarify the VOI thing, I think you have two proposals that rely just on the PSA.
Yeah.
And I think the point here is that there's a more comprehensive framework for thinking about the consequences. So you can tie those together. You don't have to just rely on the PSA.
Through net health benefit?
Yeah, and exactly. The VOI can give you a sense of the consequences of that uncertainty, and so this idea of having narrow but still 25% over versus wide and 25% over are different.
Okay.
And then the other thing is it can also be used to sort of inform what might be useful to study in an outcomes-based contract. So you can identify the key values and reducing the uncertainty of key outputs, and that might flow directly into recommendations.
Yeah.
So it's just 2 points there.
Yeah, if we do something different with our current proposal about outcomes-based contracts, one option would be, instead of stating it's a preferred option, would just be to do a better job of including an outcomes-based contract scenario, is just for payers and others to see what if you use this outcome, and we've asked before if there are any outcomes-based contracts in kind of primordial consideration. We could anonymize it and just throw it in and see what, the what if a certain % of patients didn't respond or whatever it might be. We could do that. Again, for SSTs, I have this funny feeling that the main driver is often going to be something around which an outcomes-based contract actually won't be helpful. It just won't. Now, you can say we still want it for something like Zolgensma, so that if patients end up on Spinraza after Zolgensma, then there's something going on around which we might want to have some outcomes-based contracting provisions. But if it's something like Luxturna, where the greatest uncertainty was what's the natural history of this condition 10 to 15 years out, you're stuck doing optimistic conservative scenarios or whatever in between. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Definitely. Yes, David.
David Wren from ICER. I think that, and to sort of echo Dan's comments to a degree, that the more that we have simple frameworks for looking at uncertainty, particularly if you're tying something to that, the better off you are. Because I'm picturing this situation where you do a PSA and something important to the company, for instance, is linked to that. If it hits over 25%, the price is reduced. So now there are going to be arguments about what the right distributions are and the endpoints of every number in there. And now you could imagine a distribution of PSAs. So now what's the uncertainty of the uncertainty calculation? And I don't see any end to that. So the more it's transparent and simple, if something's going to be tied to it, the better off you are. If the PSA or any other method is being used just to give a general picture, I think you're okay then.
Got it. Andreas.
If you do the PSA right, and I think, historically we haven't done a terribly good job at getting the PSAs right. I'll give you an example. Cost parameters, important economic parameters. There isn't really a distribution around the cost of a hospitalization. So we sort of nilly-willy used, minus 25%, plus 25%, but it's not really grounded in any evidence. So you're throwing in a lot of uncertainty, but it's not really real uncertainty because you don't even understand the uncertainty for some parameters. So I think in your reports going forward, I love to argue with you about the point estimates. I guess we're going to start arguing about distributions now. But those are going to be important, and I think your reports then should include an explanation around what distribution you used and why. With clinical parameters, it's relatively easy because you can just take the confidence intervals from the trials. But for economic parameters, it's extremely complicated, I would think.
Yeah. Now, you cannot imagine with what relish I look forward to arguing about PSAs. Oh, God. Yes, Pat.
Just some thoughts that came to me here. So, in trying to do outcomes-based contracting for now over 5 years and having weaving in the double digits and have fulfilled them, which is another issue. But long and the short of it is that is there a thought or possibility that the base case cost of treating the condition, if the therapy were to fail, that is what gets returned as opposed to the drug therapy cost, which is a real challenge in America with best price? So the Luxturna case, if the therapy fails, the cost then to treat given patient for the rest of their life would potentially be the outcomes-based contract. Or if the gene therapy for hemophilia fails, then the factor therapy replacement for that individual for the rest of their life, becomes the return. Or so that making that really important then to understand what the base case cost is, or the standard care cost is, in context to what the therapy cost is. And then if the therapy fails, so people just tend to forget about, or just the base case cost is just the comparison and it's in the model, but explicitly saying that outcomes-based contract terms could be if given gene therapy fails, then the return from the manufacturer is the care of that person for that condition for.
Well, I never underestimate the ingenuity of PBMs to come up with a new rebate model, Pat. But I'm not sure I've heard of that one, and I'm not sure what the legality would be of cooking up a different number. I mean, in some ways, you'd avoid Medicaid best price. This isn't a price discount. This is just a fee for failure.
That's right.
Yes.
I mean, I think we may be going a bit far afield from uncertainty, but I hear what you're saying. That outcomes-based contracts. Anyway,
I just wanted to
Mike.
we actually, and because of all the NDAs, I actually can't say anything specific, but I'm involved in about 3 discussions with gene therapy companies where we're having that discussion, which again is a separate point for what is the value that presumes that it's covered and that things don't go as expected. So they're showing an interest. And just to be clear, no one is offering to treat it for a lifetime, but they are offering up to a certain cap to pay costs associated with a failure. So.
Yeah, actually, weren't there some of the PCSK9 outcome contracts that said they would repay the hospital costs? So it wasn't, again, a kind of a tag on the price of the drug. It was a reimbursement for unanticipated
those
preventable costs.
Those discussions are happening, and I think they're
okay. So Pat,
well, it's the value of, once again, your report, because you create then that base cost of care number.
Right. So we're getting down close to the break. I just want to state again the high-level challenge here, and I'd be interested again in the life science industry. You guys have been actually relatively tame on this point. Is this just unfair for HTA to try to come up with new ways to use uncertainty to dock your price because the price is so high, even if it's in alignment with long-term value? Or is this the right way to go because it reflects reality that uncertainty should be woven into a conceptual or empirical lower price? Where do you guys stand on that? Because no, we're not going to take. I believe in democracy with a big D. This is a little D room, so we're not going to do that. But because this will come up with shared savings too towards the latter part of the day. Are we just cooking the books to keep the price down by tinkering with HTA's usual approach? I just want to put it out there as kind of a provocative question, but I can tell you honestly, from within the HTA community, certainly broadly shared as I know it, this isn't about the cost. This is about trying to figure out whether we need to adapt everything from how we look at the evidence itself, the ratings around the evidence, to the cost effectiveness kind of mechanisms and the way that our appraisal committees grapple with uncertainty, visualize it, apply it. Does it need to be different? And there's still in my mind a sense that we need to at least experiment with something. And whether it's putting out, again, different approaches to a what if on, I'm less and less, I think, tied to the PSA. I think all of us have identified some of the reasons why the PSA is a difficult tool to use as a cut point to do something different, whether it's a policy recommendation or a lower price. But going back to different scenarios, blending them or doing something else is still something that I think a lot of policymakers, broadly stated, would find interesting. Dick, and then Robin.
So I think I go back to not all uncertainty is the same, right? Certain kinds matter to patients. Some types are more important than others. Some matters to insurers. Some, and the risk preferences of patients and insurers are not all the same.
Right.
So I'm not sure there's going to be a single answer based on anything. And maybe what you need to do is think about is something a little more nuanced that looks at large versus small insurers with different risk preferences, perhaps, I don't know, how much things are important to patients, and some of the things Lou brought out. There could be, in any given case, there could be I know I'm making it complicated, but I also think it's very hard to make a single decision for everybody. And you might need to think about sort of doing some work with the payers and the patients as to, I can think of a stated preference kind of experiment you guys might do with your audience and see which parameters matter to people. And sort of, well, if you're in this side of it, this is where you need to think about maybe not covering it. If you're over here, maybe you should. So I think it's going to be a little more nuanced than we're talking
Although,
about
again,
here.
at least in ICER's context, we actually don't think about the cover, no cover decision. We think about the at what price. So we almost assume it's going to be covered. That doesn't always happen, given some evidence basis. But I think a greater challenge for us, we can always throw out a price range. But we're talking about should that price range shift? Because there's going to be one price. If we could charge a different price to people who are risk takers and risk averse people, we'd probably start to do that. But since we can't, I think that's partly where we're stuck. Robin, you get the last word before break.
Just very, very quickly. I mean, I agree totally with the point about trying to keep it simple, the uncertainty and packaging the uncertainty. I mean, over complexity, I don't think is great here. I think on the pricing models, clearly there's a discussion around pricing. From the life sciences, there needs to be an adult discussion. I think particularly around the models, payment models that are used. I think you continue discussions about it's too high, it's far too or pharma is too low. I think there's a certainly a discussion about the innovation. I think there's certainly the link, an arbitrary link to a PSA threshold for us. Was perplexing, I think would be the word, and certainly some thoughts around that. And then again, going back to incentives, I think the incentives for industry are important to provide data at launch, also at the contracting stage, but also the longer term evidence as well. So what are the incentives underpinning, I think, those 3 time horizons?
Right, okay. So first topic sorted, right? We want less uncertainty. We want to figure out how to pay in a way that incentivizes better evidence, and all the HTA communities will continue to talk about this and work with our appraisal committees, because as much as you guys are innovating, I really think you will see innovation in HTA over the coming years as we try to figure out how to package this information in a way that is better for decision making.